The tension is palpable in Dr. Phil's studio as the cameras focus on Sarah Thompson, a 32-year-old woman with tired eyes that seem to have witnessed more suffering than anyone should endure in a lifetime. Her brown hair is pulled back in a simple bun, and she wears a gray turtleneck sweater despite the heat of the spotlights. The studio light reveals small scars on her wrists, which she tries to hide by nervously pulling at her sleeves. Sitting beside her, her 29-year-old brother, Brian, keeps his eyes fixed on the studio floor as if studying every pattern on the carpet. His restless hands betray his discomfort at being exposed in front of the cameras, his fingers constantly drumming against the knee of his dark jeans. The audience watches in absolute silence, the kind of heavy silence that precedes devastating revelations. Many lean forward in their seats, already captivated by the drama about to unfold. Dr. Phil walks across the stage with measured steps, his imposing figure dominating the space with the authority earned over more than 2 decades. Conducting difficult conversations in front of the cameras, his gaze alternates between the siblings and audience as he positions his microphone. What we're going to discuss today, Dr. Phil begins, his resonant voice filling the studio, is something we rarely see, even after more than 20 years of hosting this show and hearing life stories that defy human comprehension. He pauses deliberately, the kind he's learned to use to build anticipation. A story of profound psychological manipulation, coercive control, and spiritual abuse that took place not just within a church, but within a seemingly ordinary American family. The camera zooms in on Sarah's face as a single tear rolls down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail that she doesn't bother to wipe away. Her hands are clasped so tightly that her knuckles turn white, as if she's physically holding herself up to keep from collapsing. Our father wasn't just any man in the community, Sarah finally speaks, her voice initially a whisper that gains strength as she continues. He was respected, admired, considered a man of God. People came to our house seeking spiritual guidance, advice for their marriages, help disciplining their children. She takes a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. No one questioned his methods or his intentions. Why would they? He was Pastor Thompson for 15 years, she continues, looking directly at the camera now. We believe we were participating in something sacred, something special. Our father convinced us, and dozens of other people, that he had been chosen directly by God to lead a special ministry of spiritual purification. We were too young to question when it all began. I was only 12 years old when the ritual started. The audience lets out a murmur of collective shock. A woman in the front row covers her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. Dr. Phil remains impassive, but his eyes show the compassion of someone who has heard too many stories of abuse and knows it's just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah, let's clarify a few points so that our audience fully understands. Dr. Phil gently interjects. Your father, Michael Thompson, established what he called the Ministry of Divine Purification in his small town in rural Texas. Correct? Sarah nodded. That was what he called it. To the outside world, we were just a very devout, perhaps somewhat reclusive, religious family. But inside our home, the rules were different. Brian finally lifts his eyes from the floor, his jaw tense with restrained emotion. We were completely isolated from everything and everyone, he says, his voice hoarse as if he speaks little. Homeschooling with a curriculum controlled by our father. Carefully selected friends, only children from other families in the ministry. All communication with the outside world completely monitored. Phones, letters, later emails, everything went through his scrutiny, Sarah adds. He read our diaries every night. He called it pastoral supervision. He said the world was full of impurities and demonic influences, and not only through his purification rituals could we be truly saved. And these rituals, Dr. Phil asks cautiously, what exactly did they involve? The brothers exchange a look heavy with painful memories. It depended on the offense, Brian explains, making air quotes with his fingers. It could be isolation, being locked in the basement for days with only water and a Bible, or public confessions in front of the entire ministry where you were forced to invent sins if you didn't have any real ones to confess. The more humiliating the confession, the more he believed you were being purified. And then there were the group rituals, Sarah adds, her voice faltering. Prayer circles that lasted for hours until people collapsed from exhaustion. Deliverance sessions where you were held down by other members while my father supposedly cast demons out of you. She closes her eyes for a moment, as if trying to block out the images. You quickly learned that the more you manifested, screamed, cried, writhed, the faster it was over. So we all acted. Doctor Phil approaches them, sitting down in a nearby chair. His expression is a mixture of genuine compassion and controlled indignation. Sarah, Brian, you're here today because you finally managed to escape this environment, didn't you? But there's more to this story than just escaping. Something happened recently that changed everything. Am I right? Sarah nodded slowly, wiping away tears with her hand. 3 months ago, our mother passed away from cancer. She never openly opposed our father, but on her deathbed, she told us where to find his secret diary. It was as if our entire life had been a lie constructed by our father. The diary revealed that he was never officially ordained a pastor. Brian continues, his voice firmer now, as if anger gave him strength. The divine calling he always mentioned? A complete fabrication. The ministry was just a facade to satisfy his desire for absolute control over vulnerable people. And the worst part, he stops, visibly struggling to continue. The worst part, Sarah adds for him, is that we discovered our father had a past he kept completely hidden. A past that explains a lot about the man he became, but doesn't justify what he did to us. A heavy silence hangs in the air as the cameras show the entrance from the other side of the stage. Michael Thompson walks slowly to his assigned chair. He is a tall man, around 60 years old, with meticulously combed gray hair and an erect posture that radiates a natural authority. He wears a simple, conservative suit, and his penetrating eyes sweep the studio with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding the attention of a room. Against his chest, he holds a worn brown leather briefcase, his fingers gripping the material as if protecting its precious contents. When his eyes meet those of his children, something almost imperceptible passes across his face, a shadow of emotion quickly suppressed. Before we continue with this impactful story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of Dr. Phil's upcoming revelations. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think will happen in this case. Your opinion is very important for us to continue bringing you this exclusive content that transforms lives. The studio falls into absolute silence as Michael Thompson settles into his chair, discreetly adjusting the knot of his navy blue tie. The tension in the air is almost palpable, like static electricity before a storm. His eyes meet those of his children for the first time in what seems like a very long time, and something indefinable passes between them, perhaps regret, perhaps just the shadow of it. Sarah looks away immediately, while Brian holds eye contact with an intensity that seems to dare his father to look away first. Phil doesn't allow the moment of silent confrontation to linger. He strategically positions himself among the family members, acting as a mediator prepared to intervene if necessary. His years of experience have taught him to recognize the signs of impending emotional outbursts. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Phil begins, his voice calm but assertive. You heard what your children have just shared with us and with the entire country. They describe years of psychological manipulation, severe social isolation, and what can only be classified as systematic spiritual abuse, all under the guise of a religious ministry that you created from scratch. He pauses meaningfully, allowing his words to resonate. What do you have to say about these accusations? Michael takes a deep breath, his fingers caressing the edge of the leather briefcase in his lap. A keen observer would notice a slight trembling in his hands, the only outward indication of any inner turmoil. When he finally speaks, his voice is deep and melodious, the kind of voice that naturally commands attention and respect, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to without question. Dr. Phil, I didn't come on this program to deny what I did. He begins, visibly surprising his children. I came because, after the death of Helen, my wife, I realized it's time for the truth to come out. The whole truth. He adjusts himself in his chair, looking directly at the main camera. Yes, I created the Ministry of Divine Purification. Yes, I established strict rules for my family and for the members of the ministry. Yes, I kept my children isolated from the outside world. But you and your audience need to understand that I genuinely believe I was protecting them. Dr. Phil leans forward, his skepticism evident in the way his eyes narrow slightly. Protecting them or controlling them, Mr. Thompson, because from what I understand from your children's account and our team's preliminary investigations, you never had any legitimate religious credentials. You were never ordained by any recognized institution. This entire ministry seems to have been built on a fundamental lie. It wasn't about paper credentials or institutional recognition, Michael replies, his voice gaining intensity. He leans slightly forward, the years of practice in holding the congregation's attention evident in his bearing. It was about a spiritual calling I received after a traumatic event in my youth, the death of my own father. He was a violent man, Dr. Phil, a man who preached righteousness on Sundays and practiced cruelty the rest of the week. He drank excessively and selectively used the Bible as justification for his abuses. Michael pauses, his eyes momentarily lost in distant memories. When he passed away, I vowed to protect my own family from corrupting influences like him. The rituals I created, the practices I instituted, they were a means to a greater end. I was building a spiritual fortress against the evil I witnessed firsthand. Sarah lets out a distressed sound, almost a suppressed sob. Rituals? Is that how you categorize what you did to us, Father? Her voice trembles with contained emotion. You isolated us for days in dark rooms for purification. He forced us to kneel on corn kernels until we bled while reciting verses. He forced us to confess sins we hadn't even committed. You don't understand, Sarah, Michael insists, a hint of frustration appearing for the first time in his controlled voice. The world out there is a dangerous place, full of temptations and evils you can't even imagine. I've seen it since I was a child. I grew up witnessing the worst of so-called spirituality. When I started the ministry, I truly believed I was saving souls starting with those of my own children. And what about the others? Dr. Phil interjects, redirecting the conversation. His children mentioned that his ministry included other families, other members of the community. How many people exactly participated in this ministry besides his immediate family? Michael hesitates for the first time, his fingers drumming lightly against the leather folder. It started with just our family, Helen, me, and the children. Then, some close friends from the local church started attending our Sunday meetings at home. They saw positive changes in our lives, discipline, purpose, dedication, and wanted the same for their families. He clears his throat slightly. Over time, maybe 40 people, at its peak. Brian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor with a thud that echoed through the studio. That's a blatant lie. His voice exploded with years of pent-up rage. There were over 100 people at the peak. You kept meticulous records of every member, every purification, every confession. Records that the police found when they finally investigated the compound after the first allegations surfaced. Records that you kept locked away in that room where no one was allowed to enter. The forbidden room, Sarah adds, visibly trembling as the memory seems to envelop her. The office with the red door in the basement, where you kept all the evidence of sins you collected during confessions. Photographs, recordings, letters, diaries. You documented every moment of weakness of every person, didn't you, Dad? The last word comes out like an accusation. Michael's face hardens almost imperceptibly, but years of behavioral analysis allow Dr. Phil to notice the change. I was documenting the spiritual progress of each member, Michael replies, his voice controlled again. It was my duty as a spiritual leader to keep records of each soul's journey under my care. The documentation was for their protection and for the ministry's protection. Brian laughs humorlessly. Or was it emotional blackmail? Insurance to ensure that no one would ever question his authority or try to leave. Because we all knew that if we tried to abandon the flock, you wouldn't hesitate to expose the sins you had collected. Drive-off Phil shakes his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. Mr. Thompson, I'm really trying to understand your perspective here, to give you the opportunity to explain your actions. But what your children describe and what our preliminary investigations confirm sounds like an elaborate and sophisticated system of control based on fear, guilt, and shame, not on any genuine spiritual principle that I know of. Michael gripped the leather briefcase tighter, his fingers turning slightly white with the pressure. His expression shifted subtly, like someone arriving at a crucial decision after long internal deliberation. You don't understand because you weren't there, Drive-off Phil. You didn't see what I saw. You didn't live what I lived. His fingers caressed the leather of the briefcase almost unconsciously. Perhaps it's time to show, not just tell. Perhaps it's time to reveal the truth. The whole truth that not even my children know. The entire studio seems to collectively hold its breath as Michael places the folder on the side table between the chairs. The sound of the leather against the wood resonates in the tense silence. This folder, he says, looking directly at his children now, contains the answer to the question you'd have been asking since you were little. Why did I start the ministry? Why did I become the man I am? It's all here. He touches the folder almost reverently, and after you see its contents, perhaps, just perhaps, you can begin to understand, even if you never come to forgive. The entire studio seems to hold its collective breath as Michael Thompson slowly, almost ritually, opens the leather briefcase. The leather creaks softly, a sound that seems amplified in the tense silence. His hands, now visibly trembling, pull out an old photo album with a black cover. Worn by time and frequent handling, the binding is partially undone, and yellowed pages are visible at the edges. Michael places the album on his lap, his hands resting on it as if he were about to open the sacred text. "I've never shown this to anyone," he says, his voice lower and less controlled than before. "Not even to his mother. This album is the reason for everything, every decision I made, every rule I imposed, every ritual I created." He looks up at his children. "This was never about control, Dr. Phil, despite what my children believe. It was about documentation, about preserving the evidence of what I saw, what I lived through, and what I was determined to stop from continuing." Sarah and Brian exchange confused and apprehensive glances. It's clear they didn't expect their father to bring any kind of physical evidence to this show, much less something he claims he's never shared with anyone. "What kind of documentation are we talking about here, Murdoch Thompson, Doctor?" Phil asks, his voice cautious as he moves closer, his professional interest clearly piqued. "The real reason I started the ministry," Michael replies, opening the album with almost reverent care. "These photos were taken over several years, starting when I was just 16. I used a Polaroid camera I'd received for Christmas. My father never knew." Michael flips through a few pages, his fingers caressing the old photographs protected by yellowed plastic. "My father wasn't just violent or abusive in the way most people would understand. He was the leader of something much darker, something that hid behind the respectable facade of our local church." He turns the album over so that Dr. Phil can see its contents. The show's camera doesn't show the images directly, but it captures the host's reaction. His eyes widen and his face visibly pales in a genuine reaction rarely seen in the veteran host, known for his unflappable composure in the face of shocking revelations. "Dr. Phil glances quickly at the production team in the corner of the studio, making meaningful eye contact with the executive producer, and then returns his attention to the photographs. "Murdoch Thompson, what exactly am I seeing here, Doctor?" Phil's voice lost its characteristic confidence, replaced by a gravity that reflected the seriousness of the moment. "My father called it the inner circle," Michael explains, slowly turning the pages of the album. Each page turn seems to release more tension in the studio. "A select group of 12 men from the community who met monthly in our house, in the basement, under the guise of advanced Bible studies and planning church activities. They were respected in the community, a school principal, to deacons, a local doctor, businessmen, a police officer." Michael pauses, his gaze momentarily lost in the photographs. What really happened during these meetings? His voice falters momentarily, and he needs to take a deep breath to continue. What really happened were rituals, not spiritual or religious ones, as they claim to the few who might question them, but something much more physical, carnal, some would say. The black and white photos, partially revealed when Michael turns the album towards Dr. Phil, show groups of men in simple clothes around tables with symbols drawn on them. Some images show young men sitting in circles, with blank expressions, as if they were in a trance or heavily sedated. "These were teenagers from the community," Michael continues, pointing to one of the photos with a slightly trembling finger, "recruited for what my father called special discipleship training. I was one of them when I was 16. We were being prepared to eventually join the circle when we were worthy." His voice carries a palpable bitterness in the last word. Michael takes a deep breath before continuing, as if each word required a physical effort. "My father photographed everything, keeping meticulous records in a diary that he locked in his office. When he died of a heart attack, I was the first to arrive home. I found the key and accessed his records before anyone else could. That's when I discovered the full extent of what was happening, not just in our city, but in a network of similar communities across the state." He closes his eyes for a moment, as if fighting back painful memories. "It was at that moment that I decided I needed to do something to protect my own family from the same fate, to break the cycle." Doctor Phil flips through the album, then another page, his growing horror evident in every line of his experienced face. When he reaches a particular photo, he stops abruptly, his expression transforming into something rarely seen by viewers of the show, genuine, unconventional shock. Is that you? Asks Dr. Phil, pointing to a thin teenager in the picture, almost unrecognizable compared to the man sitting in front of him today. Michael nods gravely. I was 16. The one next to me was my best friend, Thomas. He didn't survive the training. Officially, it was a car accident. His words hang in the air, laden with grim implications. And this, he turns another page, revealing a photo that makes Dr. Phil physically recoil in his chair, his eyes momentarily closing as if trying to block out the image. This is the real reason I created my own ministry, to stop this from continuing, to create a barrier between my children and my father's legacy. The camera focuses on the expressions of Sarah and Brian, who have yet to see the contents of the album. Their faces show a mixture of confusion, apprehension, and the beginning of what seems to be a terrifying realization. Phil studies the photos for a few more moments in absolute silence. The studio is so quiet you could hear the proverbial pin drop. Then, with sudden decisiveness, he looks at the production team and then directly at the main camera. His expression is one of absolute determination as he utters the words that no one in the studio expected to hear. Stop all the cameras. Now, this isn't going there like this. The studio immediately erupts in confused murmurs. The audience stirs, some people partially rising from their seats, trying to see what caused this unprecedented reaction. The technicians exchange bewildered glances, uncertain whether they should actually follow the instruction. Sarah and Brian seem completely shocked, looking from their father to Dr. Phil and back, trying to comprehend what they have just witnessed. Dr. Phil doesn't wait for the team's reaction. He stands up, his posture radiating unquestionable authority. I'm serious. Turn off the cameras. All of them. He makes a circular gesture with his hand, indicating the entire studio. I want all non-essential personnel out of the studio right now. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and I only want the senior production team, security, and our legal counsel here when we return. The stage manager finally reacts, signaling to the camera crews. The operators begin to switch off their equipment one by one. Red recording lights going out in sequence around the studio. The audience, guided by visibly confused production assistants, begins to rise and head for the exits in a murmur of excited speculation. Phil approaches Michael, speaking in a low but intense voice. Mr. Thompson, what you brought to light today goes far beyond the scope of a television program. This is evidence of something that needs to be dealt with by the appropriate authorities. Michael nodded slowly, carefully closing the album. I know. That's why I came. I needed my children to understand. But I also needed to create a public record that this evidence exists before officially handing it over. Powerful people are still involved. Phil. People who would prefer this never came to light. As the studio empties, a single camera continues recording discreetly, not for broadcast, but for legal documentation of what is about to be revealed. The studio is now almost unrecognizable compared to the vibrant, brightly lit scene of minutes ago. Most of the lights have been turned off, leaving only minimal ambient lighting. The rows of audience seats are empty, creating a vacuum where there was once energy and anticipation. The silence that now dominates the space is different, heavier, more meaningful. Only a small group remains. Dr. Phil, Michael Thompson and his two sons, the show's executive producer, a woman in formal attire who is clearly the legal counsel, and the security guards discreetly positioned near the exits. The atmosphere is thick with unresolved tension and a feeling that everyone is breathing air laden with revelations that cannot be undone. A single camera continues recording, its operator maintaining a respectful distance. Mr. Thompson. Dr. Phil begins, sitting directly across from Michael in a more informal posture now that they are no longer performing for an audience. His voice is controlled, but with an underlying urgency that reveals the gravity of the situation. What you showed me goes far beyond the scope of this program. These are not simply photos of a family cult or unconventional religious rituals. As we initially discussed in the pre-interview, Dr. Phil carefully chooses his next words. What I'm seeing here is evidence of what appears to be a systematic and organized abuse ring involving minors that operated under the guise of religious activities in your community for decades. Am I correct in this assessment? Michael nods slowly, his posture now less rigid, as if a huge weight were gradually being lifted from his shoulders. Yes, you are. What began with my father continued long after his death. Others took the lead, expanded the activities, refined the methods. The circle exists to this day, although with a different name and a different facade. Sarah and Brian exchange shocked glances. Their expressions reveal that they are hearing this information for the first time. Understanding begins to form on their faces, the pieces of a dark puzzle finally falling into place. What is he talking about? Sarah asks, her voice almost inaudible. She turns to her father, years of anger momentarily replaced by genuine confusion. What's in those pictures, Dad? Michael looks at his children with a complex expression that mixes deep shame and reluctant relief. For years, you've seen me as the villain of the story, the controlling and abusive father who invented the ministry to dominate you and others. The truth is more complicated. He takes a deep breath. I created the ministry to protect you from your grandfather's legacy, from the reach of the circle he helped create. These photos document a system of abuse that operated in our city for 3 generations. Michael opens the album again, this time turning it so his children can see. The camera remains distant, not capturing the specific content, but recording Sarah and Brian's devastating reactions. Sarah brings her hand to her mouth, her eyes instantly welling up with tears. Brian remains completely still, as if he had been turned to stone. Your grandfather wasn't just one of the participants. He was one of the main leaders when I was young, Michael continues, his voice now softer. I was recruited at 16. I was a victim before I became complicit through my silence. Doctor. Phil carefully flips through the album once more, his professional eye studying each image. Some of these people in the photos. He pauses, choosing his words with extreme care. I recognize faces that, according to our preliminary research, are still prominent figures in your community today. Exactly, Michael confirms, his gaze meeting Doctor. Phil's with renewed intensity. The circle was never really dismantled. When my father died, someone else took over. Then another. The facade changed, from a Bible study group to a community action committee, then to a youth charity foundation. But the core remained. Michael turns his attention to his children, who are still absorbing the shock of the images. When Helen became pregnant with you, Sarah, I knew I had to do something drastic. I knew the pattern, how they selected families, how they identified vulnerable children. His voice falters momentarily. I created our ministry as a fortress to keep my family isolated from them. Yes. I was controlling. Yes. I used fear tactics. Yes. I created rituals that, I see now, caused their own kind of harm. Because I knew they were still out there, watching, looking for new victims. Brian stands up. Abruptly, his face a mask of fury and confusion. So your solution to protecting us from an abusive cult was to create your own, to traumatize us in order to protect us. His voice rises, echoing in the empty studio. What kind of twisted logic is that, Father? You kept us prisoners. I was damaged. Michael replies, tears now streaming freely down his wrinkled face, probably the first his children had ever seen him shed. So damaged that I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't know how to love without controlling. I couldn't trust the world that had stolen my own innocence. He wipes his face with the back of his hand. I only knew that I needed to keep you safe at all costs. The purification rituals, the isolation, it was all designed to ensure that you would never be considered viable candidates for their recruitment. To keep you off the radar, the legal consultant, who has remained silent until now, approaches Dr. Thompson. These photographs and your testimony constitute potential evidence in a criminal investigation. You are aware of this, correct? Michael nods. Fully aware. That's why I went public. I've tried going to the authorities before, twice in the last 20 years. The investigations were systematically shelved. Many of the circle's members are in positions of power, judiciary, local politics, police department. He looks at Drive.Phil. I needed a public platform, a record that couldn't simply be erased. Doctor. Phil turns to Sarah and Brian, whose worlds have just been turned upside down again. Did you have any idea about this? Any suspicions about your father's past or his true motivations for the ministry? Sarah shakes her head slowly, still in shock. Mom sometimes mentioned that Dad had had a difficult childhood, but she never went into detail. He never, ever talked about his past or about our grandfather, except to say that he was a stern man. Because I wanted to protect them from the truth, Michael insists, reaching out toward his children, though he doesn't quite touch them. I wanted you to grow up without the weight of the knowledge I carried. No, Dad, Brian replies, his voice calmer now, but heavy with sadness and reluctant understanding. You wanted to protect yourself from facing your own trauma, and you used us as shields in the process. You replicated the abuse in a different form, don't you realize? Less severe, perhaps, but still abuse. A heavy silence follows his words. Michael lowers his head, the truth of his son's words clearly hitting him hard. Doctor. Phil intervenes after a few moments. Thompson, what do you intend to do with this documentation now? Michael takes a deep breath, composing himself. I'm ready to hand everything over to federal authorities, not local ones. For the reasons I explained, some of the men in these photos are still alive and in positions of significant power. It's time they faced the justice my father never faced. That's why you actually came to the show, isn't it, Doctor? Phil asks, understanding finally dawning on him. To create a public record before going to the authorities? Some kind of insurance? Partially, Michael admits, carefully closing the album. But also because, after Helen's death, I realized it was time for my children to know the whole truth, however painful it may be. He looks at Sarah and Brian. I don't expect forgiveness. I know I caused irreparable damage with my methods, but I hope that, in time, you can understand that every action, however misguided, came from a place of love and fear, a fear you never had to know because I carried it for you. Phil turns to the camera, which is still discreetly recording. What we are witnessing today goes far beyond a family drama. We are facing what appears to be evidence of an organized criminal network that has operated for decades under the guise of community and religious respectability. This is not the type of content I can, in good conscience, broadcast in our regular format. He looks at the legal consultant, who nods in silent agreement. Let's end this recording now and begin the process of contacting the appropriate federal authorities. Mr. Thompson, his children, and the evidence presented today need protection that goes beyond what a television program can offer. The camera captures one last image of the three Thompsons, a father and his two sons, connected by a legacy of trauma and secrets, but perhaps, finally, on the path to a different kind of truth. 3 months later, Dr. Phil's studio presents a markedly different atmosphere. The set has been reconfigured for a more intimate interview, less dramatic, more contemplative. There is no audience present, just Dr. Phil sitting in a comfortable armchair in a setting that resembles a cozy office more than the stage for emotional confrontations the show became known for. Phil looks directly at the camera, his expression serious yet compassionate. He is dressed more casually than usual, as if to signal the special nature of this episode. The atmosphere is somber, reflecting the gravity of the subject that is about to be discussed. About 90 days ago, Dr. Phil begins, his voice measured and reflective. I did something I've never done in over the decades of hosting this show. I interrupted a recording mid-interview and ordered the cameras to be turned off. Today, after weeks of consultations with child protection experts, legal authorities, and most importantly, the people involved themselves, I can finally share with you why. He pauses meaningfully, adjusting himself in his chair as if preparing to lift a significant weight. The photographs and documents that Michael Thompson brought to our studio that day were not simply evidence of controversial religious practices or a dysfunctional family. They were evidence of something far darker, an organized system of abuse that had operated silently for decades in a small Texas community, protected by individuals in positions of trust and authority. The camera briefly shows images of newspaper headlines about the ensuing investigation, with faces and names appropriately blurred to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation and the identities of the victims. This evidence led to one of the largest investigations into organized abuse in the region's history. 8 arrests have already been made, including a local judge to prominent businessmen and a retired school principal. Federal authorities believe there may be dozens of victims spread over several decades. The case continues to develop, with more arrests expected in the coming weeks. Dr. Phil stands and walks slowly around the office as he continues his account. Michael Thompson voluntarily handed over all the evidence to federal authorities and is fully cooperating with the investigation. He provided names, dates, locations, and other details that were meticulously documented in his personal records. He began keeping when he was just 16 years old, initially as a means of preserving his own sanity in the face of the unimaginable. He stops near a bookshelf, leaning lightly against it, while his own actions in creating a controlling and psychologically abusive environment for his family remain deeply problematic and indefensible. Federal prosecutors are considering his role as an initial victim and eventually as a whistleblower in the wider case. He will face consequences for his actions, but within a context that acknowledges the complexity of his situation. Dr. Phil returns to his seat, leaning slightly forward as if sharing something personal with the viewer. Sarah and Brian Thompson are now in intensive therapy with trauma specialists, working to process not only the coercive control and psychological abuse they suffered under their father's ministry, but also this shocking revelation about their family's past, a past that contextualizes, though does not justify, their father's actions. He pauses, carefully choosing his next words. They gave me permission to share that, although the relationship with their father remains extremely complicated and painful, they have begun the difficult process of understanding and contextualizing things. Brian recently told me, "I'm still furious with my father for what he did to us, but now I understand that he was trying to protect us in the only way his trauma-damaged brain could conceive." Phil shifts in his chair, his face taking on a more serious expression. I made the decision to stop that recording because there's a line between television entertainment and moral responsibility that I refuse to cross. The evidence I saw that day needed to go directly to the appropriate authorities, not be sensationalized or turned into content to boost ratings. There were victims whose stories weren't mine to tell. There was a potential investigation that couldn't be compromised. And there was the psychological well-being of the Thompsons themselves to consider. He takes a deep breath, his eyes momentarily shifting from the camera as if contemplating something distant. In all my years working as a psychologist and presenter, I have rarely witnessed a case that so clearly illustrated the concept of intergenerational trauma, how abuse and suffering can be passed down from one generation to the next, often in ways that the affected individuals themselves do not fully understand. Phil returns to his desk and sits down, his expression serious and thoughtful. This story reminds us of some fundamental truths that we often discuss on this program, or rarely see illustrated so vividly and painfully. First, untreated trauma doesn't simply disappear with time. It persists, transforms, and is often passed down from generation to generation, sometimes in forms that seem unrecognizable compared to the original trauma. Michael Thompson, desperately trying to protect his children from the evil he knew intimately, ended up replicating patterns of control and manipulation. He replaced physical abuse with psychological abuse, sexual exploitation with emotional exploitation. In the process of trying to build a fortress against an external monster, he inadvertently became a different version of what he feared most. Phil raises a finger to emphasize his next point. Second, deep family secrets rarely remain buried forever, no matter how carefully guarded. The truth, however painful and disturbing, eventually finds a way to surface. The Thompsons lived for decades in a reality built on omissions, half-truths, and calculated silences. And as inevitably happens, when those secrets finally emerged, the impact was all the more devastating for having been delayed for so long. And finally, Dr. Phil continues, his voice taking on a slightly more hopeful tone. Even in the darkest and seemingly irreparable stories, there is the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility of redemption and healing. Michael Thompson has spent decades hiding his past and controlling his family out of fear. Now, for the first time, he is facing the truth and allowing his children to do the same. Dr. Phil pauses for a final moment, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Families can be sources of our deepest and most enduring traumas. The bonds that should sustain and nurture us can, under tragic circumstances, become ropes that bind us to patterns of pain and despair. But with courage, honesty, and the right support, these same families can also become the setting for our most meaningful healing. He looks directly at the camera, his voice carrying the weight of decades of professional experience. That's why I stopped the cameras that day. Because some revelations are too sacred to become a spectacle. Some healing journeys need to begin in private, with dignity and respect, before they can be shared with the world. The camera slowly zooms in as Dr. Phil concludes, in my more than 20 years hosting this program, talking to people in their most vulnerable and painful moments, I've learned that the truth, however difficult, however ugly, however painful, is always the essential first step toward healing. For Michael, Sarah, and Brian Thompson, that courageous first step was taken in our studio. away from the cameras. And although we stopped recording that day, I'm sharing this story now, with their explicit permission, because I believe it can help others who are trapped in similar cycles of trauma and secrets. Phil leaned slightly forward, his face filling the frame in a moment of intimacy with the viewer. Sometimes, the most powerful act we can perform is not to speak, but to listen. Not to expose, but to protect. Not to judge, but to understand. And sometimes, as we all learned in the studio that day, the most responsible thing we can do when confronted with an unbearable truth is simply to stop, breathe, and ensure that this truth is handled with the care it deserves. The image slowly fades to black, Dr. Phil's pensive face being the last thing viewers see before the credits begin to roll. There's no dramatic music, no preview of the next episode, just respectful silence, inviting the audience to reflect on what they have just witnessed, not just a family drama, but a meditation on how trauma propagates through generations and how, with courage and truth, these cycles can finally be broken.